Hey there, and welcome to an installment in the Caxy series about how we think. And so, a lot of what we're trying to do is in kind of communicating what we do as a company and how we operate, talking about some of the problems that we face and how we get through them. So, one of the ones that Josh, who heads up our technology here at Caxy, and I were talking about is this idea of getting stuck and then getting unstuck, and how that's a big moment for people in a development life cycle. So I figured maybe we start with you, Josh, talking about like what's it like to be stuck and what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, definitely. So coming from a perspective of a developer, getting stuck, there's lots of different types of stuck. And so specifically, we're thinking, um, uh, the types are you don't know where to start at all. That's certainly one type of being stuck. Um, or you ran into a roadblock or an issue, you're trying to troubleshoot something, but you don't know how to solve this issue, and you've tried many things, and you just are stuck. And then another type is actually you don't know if it's even possible to solve this, and you end up getting stuck. I think today we'll definitely be focusing on that second one, which is where you run into a roadblock, an issue. You're in the middle of solving a problem and you don't know how to get yourself unstuck from this problem. So we'll
So
talk through
maybe
some ideas of
yeah.
how to do that.
So maybe an existential question. You're working on something. When are you stuck versus I'm still hacking away at this and trying to make it work? Like what is like is it just like you've been trying the same thing for hours or something? How would you define that?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think everyone has a different kind of level of when they consider themselves stuck. I think it's certainly you've tried a lot of different options and end up trying the same ones like you mentioned. I think
Mm,
it's certainly where or every option you're trying results in the same result. So you're not really making progress on solving the issue. I think that's certainly one. When you're not stuck is if you are trying to solve like a larger issue, but you end up solving, one part of it here, you then get stuck on the next piece, but you're working on it and you can solve that. I think you're still making progress there. So I wouldn't consider that being stuck. I think there's certainly some efficiencies that you could find in solving, the overall problem, but it's certainly where you're at the point where you feel like all everything's lost and you don't know
yeah.
where to go.
Yeah, and you touched on the last one. I think part of it is there's a mindset around this is solvable. So like, and part of it
Yeah,
is if you don't believe it can be solved, it's definitely not going to get solved. But if you believe in it, then you can at least keep trying things out to figure out an answer. So maybe talk a little bit
exactly.
about like your as you help other people like as they come in the company, what are the things that you do or think about to help them with strategies for getting unstuck?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that people don't do that I think I usually take for granted, but I've learned over time working with people that it's really helpful to teach some of the basics, and even having a checklist for people is really
Mm,
helpful of the steps to go through, because oftentimes when you're in the middle of an issue and you're stuck, it's hard to step back and actually think through what have I tried so far and what other things should I try. Oftentimes people will get stuck in the I'm trying the same type of thing over and
yeah,
over. Um, and so I think there's a lot to it. One piece is Googling. Googling is a skill actually, and that's always funny to say. And developers always joke that like half of their job is actually just searching on Stack Overflow or Google, and
yeah,
that's true. But I think there's also a skill behind being able to find the results that you're looking for. And then
okay,
also, even if you find the results, it's being able to assess whether this is the right solution for, my issue. Um, and I've found working with a lot of people that while I'm troubleshooting an issue, oftentimes I'll go to a link and I'll quickly go back because I saw that it wasn't actually what I needed. And they usually ask, how did you know that so quickly?
yeah.
And that's
How do you
certainly a
know?
skill. I think it's definitely pattern recognition,
Mm,
and oftentimes it's understanding more around your problem that you're trying to solve. So sometimes it will be entirely different tech stack, and it seemed like the right result, but it's actually unrelated completely to the issue.
yeah,
Um, or it could be that they are solving, a different issue that I already knew, was possible, but I've already eliminated that.
Mhm.
So I think there's certainly a lot of skills around just diagnosing what the solution is too, and
Sure.
understanding that.
And how about, because I know I've been in this situation where you find something on Stack Overflow that seems to get you somewhere, but then kind of doesn't, or get you 90%, and the 10% is really what you needed help with, but yet you keep hacking away at it for hours. And I'm using hacking in a very positive sense, like trying, you know.
Yeah.
Um, how do you handle a situation like that?
I'm definitely. I usually like to go back and scrap it and try something else. I still keep it back there because I know I got to 90% of the way here. But if I'm not seeing the end of the tunnel, it's okay to scrap that and try something else. Even if
Yeah.
that was really close, it might not be the actual right solution. It could have been taking you down the wrong direction that seemed like it was solving most of the problem, but ultimately
Mhm.
wouldn't. So I think a lot of times people get into rabbit holes, and I oftentimes, when I'm searching for a solution or just help on a specific troubleshooting issue, I'll open 10 links from the first search page, and I'll go through each one of those before I even try any, to kind of get a feel for what's out there. Are there similarities between these issues that people are reporting? Are they completely different? I think all of that is really really helpful to just kind of assess first what options you have there, before deep diving into trying one of the solutions.
And maybe it's something we've actually talked about in the past. Talk about what you actually put in Google. So, like, what do
Yes,
you put in
so
the
that's a
search
big
bar?
one. And I've learned actually now when helping someone who's stuck, I always ask them, "What did you search for in Google?" And if it's an error specifically, I will say, "Did you copy and paste the full error in and put that into Google?" And oftentimes they'll say no. And when we do it, the first result or on the first page, you'll find the exact
Right.
solution for this issue. So it's certainly, copy and paste the full error first, and maybe you'll want to tag the tech stack that you're working in or the framework, language in front or at the end of the search. And then always, error messages will sometimes include your system details and stuff like that. Remove all of that junk and just include the actual error itself, even if it's a really generic, seemingly generic error. If you include the tech stack with it, usually you'll find it.
Yeah, amazing. It's amazing. Like, I've never found anything that didn't already have someone that had encountered it. So those
Yeah,
brave heroes at Stack Overflow who are answering the questions, shout out to you, because still after all these years, I've never put anything in there. So that's really,
exactly.
you know,
Yeah,
one of the other
definitely.
things you talked about was this idea of just taking the time to read the code, and that's a skill in and of itself.
Yeah.
What about that contributes to getting unstuck?
Yeah, so that's one of the beautiful things of working with open source code is you often have the code right in front of you. And so a lot of people, a lot of the issues when people get stuck are actually related to the code, a third party code that they're working with, that isn't working as expected or isn't working as the documentation states. And a lot of people will get stuck there if the documentation doesn't explain how to solve this issue. And so one of the big things that we really focus on is getting better at reading other people's code, specifically framework or libraries, the code, of the open source dependencies that you're using. Because when you dive into the code and you actually find where this piece is failing, maybe it's a conditional, an if statement that, is actually resulting in the error that you're getting or resulting in the use case that you weren't expecting. You can take a look at exactly what that if condition is and see, trace back to what those variables are, how you're passing that data in, does it align? Because open source code is great, but it also means that documentation might not be up to date, because
Right.
they aren't explicitly required to have their documentation
Sure.
up to date. We're not paying them to use this, so we should never expect it to be fully up to date. And so that's certainly a big piece. I think
Yeah.
also, reading through the code that other people wrote on your project. It's always tracing back the code and reading through, okay, if I input this data, how would this code react? Um,
Hmm.
One of the big things that we always say is that the code is doing exactly what you programmed it to do. It's not a weird fluke. It's almost never a crazy edge case with a third party
Sure.
service. And so a lot of it comes down to just setting aside your ego and knowing that you will make mistakes, you will make typos. And so throw all of that aside, throw away your assumptions, and just look back, follow through the code, and see what it's actually doing.
Yeah. So what do you do if, if it's not in the documentation or the documentation is wrong? Um, because I think a lot of people just assume like, third party library or something, they just assume, well, of course it works. It can't be the problem. How do you bridge the gap and get in there and open yourself to maybe the possibility that that's the problem?
Yeah, so I think there's two different approaches, and I do both. If you use an IDE that has auto completion and go to definition, we use PHP Storm. Other people use Visual Studio Code. You can jump to that code right in your source code if it's locally downloaded files. That's usually what I'll first try to do. Is I'll see jump into their code base and see what function I'm calling, so my entry point into that code, and then I trace through the code to find out what it's actually doing, following it just like I would if it were my own code. So that's really helpful working with the IDE. Um, and if you're working in a language where you can actually modify that source code um, temporarily while you're working through it, you can add debug statements within their code and
Yeah.
dump out what data it's getting. That's often what we'll do is we'll throw debug statements in there, console logs, to see what out or what input this function is actually receiving, and is that matching what input I'm sending it? Because sometimes it will be mismatched, and then you have a going off point. So I think
Yeah.
a lot of it when you are stuck is just finding the going off point and eliminating variables.
Yeah. Well, so talk about that because I know one of the things I've heard you talk about is troubleshooting in the moment and eliminating variables is one of those. What about being in the moment? Do you think is productive about getting unstuck?
Yeah, so I think stepping back and just eliminating as much as possible of what we know isn't the issue, or identifying where this issue is being caused. So at the very basic level of if you're working in a decoupled application where you have a separate front end that talks to a back end, determining if it's on the back end or the front end. I think that's a really important step, and is one that you can quickly determine by either looking at the network requests in the browser or adding logging to the front end or the back end, comparing, seeing where the disconnect is. Once you have that, you can chop off half of your code base and start focusing there. So other things are um, you can filter it down to the exact endpoint that's causing issues. Oftentimes, if you're totally unsure where this issue is, digging into the network requests to the API or logging those, finding where this disconnect is happening. Once you find that piece of code, the line of code, and if you have an error message, most error messages will include that line of code there for you. And a lot of people don't actually look there first, but that's usually one of the first places you look is you jump right to that line of code that has the issue. So once
Yeah.
you have the line of code, this entry point into the problem, then you start eliminating variables in terms of what you're expecting this line of code to be doing. Um, Dump out any inputs to it. Make sure that they align with what you're expecting. So
Yeah.
a big thing I always say is eliminate your assumptions too. So eliminate variables, but also eliminate your assumptions. Um, you don't just assume that the data that you're sending to this API is actually untouched coming right to this function. Make sure that it's actually getting the data that you're expecting. That's oftentimes a big one where people can get stuck for hours and hours trying to troubleshoot an issue that's actually not in the code that they were looking at. It's actually before then. So I think that's certainly an important aspect of it.
I really like the idea about like getting rid of the assumptions because I think a lot of times with trying to solve a problem, you lock off a number of different avenues because well, it can't possibly be that, And in a way, that whole catch-22 thing about you can't keep trying the same thing over and over again without, that's the definition of insanity. Like you're looking at the problem. You're like, well, it couldn't be the browser, or it couldn't be that their computer is turned off, or it couldn't be, well, maybe it is. And so some of that is you just have to keep expanding your circle to look at other possibilities until you find the one that is the cause, because it could be anything in the whole system.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so when eliminating variables, you do need to be really careful that you are actually proving to yourself that this isn't the issue.
Right.
Because I think a lot of people will quickly eliminate things just in their mind to say there's no way that that's the issue. Um, and oftentimes, if it is in there, it would take hours to loop back and retest that. So it's certainly proving that those aren't the issue, even if 99% of the time it's not the issue. I always double check. And so a
Yeah.
lot of people will get frustrated while I'm troubleshooting sometimes, where it's like, why did you need to test that? Don't we
Yeah.
know for sure that it's going to be the case?
Right. And there's also a little bit of priority setting to it too. So like we've talked about, is it the third party library or is it your code? It's probably your code, but don't
Yeah.
rule out the third party library. Like we were joking before we got on here, my camera wasn't working. And I went through all these steps, and in my head I started to think about like, well, maybe the camera's broken. And like, I just use it. It can't be the camera. And it ended up being I had the camera disabled, which is sort of like if you start closer to the things that you've affected in the system, it's probably that and not you're going to blame something else. That's usually a good place to
Yeah,
prioritize.
definitely. Yeah, and I think a
Um,
big one that reminded me of just some other tips for eliminating variables is to look into where it is working. Is it an issue that is only on your branch due to the changes that you currently have locally? If that's the case, then you already eliminated a ton of variables, and now you just need to look at what changes you've introduced and see which piece of that could have actually changed it.
yeah,
Similarly to checking all of the environments. So is this an issue on production? If it's not, is it
yeah,
an issue on staging, on QA, etc., to determine where the issue is actually introduced, because it could be a regression that you're trying to troubleshoot there, because that can
yeah.
also help to compare the code that's running on production versus the code that's running locally to see what has changed.
Yeah. I'm curious. So thinking about the value of getting unstuck. So we're in consulting, which means we pay a lot of attention to how much time you spend on something because it's very, visible to the project and our clients and stuff. But even like in a product setting, if you're working on a product, spending 2 months on the, something login validator, probably isn't worth it. And so I'm curious for you, at what point do you look at, I've been working on this sort of like in a way long enough that I need to try something new, reach out, get help from other people, whatever. Where do you draw the line about how much is on you to solve on yourself, and then look for others?
Yeah, so it's certainly a line that I think developers struggle with a lot, because part of the reason that we're so passionate about development is because we love solving problems. We love to be, you know, going up against a challenge and knocking it over. And so it's always difficult, I think, for developers to admit defeat. But you have to remember that you're not really admitting defeat. You're just bringing in some additional assistance. So I think the timer for me personally is one. I think that just the total number of hours that I have spent on this versus the estimate. Usually, work is estimated in terms of how long it would take you. Maybe that's an internal estimate if you don't have one set kind of at the business level. Um, but keeping track of where you are, time estimate versus the actual estimate of the work, and comparing that. If I'm halfway through the ticket and I haven't gotten anywhere, that's going to be a problem, and
Yeah,
I would consider reaching out at that point, because clearly I need to kind of get some direction there. And I think it's also, are you making progress on this solution? I think is a big one, and that's always really hard to know. Are you just trying 10 different approaches and none of them have shown any promising results? Or are you actually down the path of resolving this issue and getting yourself unstuck? Are you making progress in terms of you've found what you think is the issue and you're doing a test here? or you've eliminated these number of variables, but you're still not sure on, these four different things that it could be. I think in that case, it's communication is really important with the team or whoever is expecting this work. But also, if you are making that progress, it's important to communicate, what you have done and what's left, because I think that can really buy you that additional time that you need to solve that issue.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance because on one hand you want people to have the time and space to work on the problem on their own, but also, um, with the example of spending 2 months on something that should have been, whatever the shorter period is, a week or something, that's actually worse. So solving it is great, but solving it in 8x the time isn't really as valuable. And it's much better, even though it doesn't seem so much more valuable to reach out when you've dug in enough and you really are stuck after having tried all the stuff we just talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think there's a lot that should be done if you do get to the point, which is it happens all the time where you do need to reach out for help. When you do get to that point, it's really important that you come back to it after the fact. And
mhm,
so you need to be your own advocate for learning what you didn't know in the beginning. And so if it's possible, if you do need to hand over the work or kind of pair program the work with somebody, make sure that you take the time to go back to it and see what the ultimate solution was, and then reverse engineer that. Take steps backwards to find out what steps was I missing? What steps could I have taken by myself to get to this solution? Was it actually possible for me? Because sometimes there's just a knowledge gap of some crucial piece of knowledge that someone doesn't have yet that
yeah,
is required to solve that problem. Um, but you do want to find out what was missing there so that the next time you face that problem or a similar problem, you know what steps you could take. I think that's one that a lot of people, especially in the consulting business where you want to remain billable and you want to move on to the next thing to make sure that you're being productive. A lot of people kind of forget to do that step, but I think it's really
yeah.
crucial to learning.
Well, how about maybe as a final point and kind of how we try to solve some of this from the cultural side, talk a little bit about like how you create a culture where it's okay to come in and ask these questions and it's not like you get, shot down for asking a silly question or something. Because you're right, sometimes it's a missing piece of information. That's all that it was.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone at Caxy for sure is open and willing and always will jump up to the opportunity to help. And so there, you will never be met with negativity or anything if you're asking questions or need help or you are stuck and you reach out. So that's certainly our culture will always encourage that. Oftentimes we joke, somewhat joking, of like, you will never get fired for asking too many questions, but you would get fired for never asking a question
Yeah.
if you end up getting stuck. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things that we always tell our developers as they come in, because we want to make sure that they're being productive and also learning too. And we don't want you just being stuck, spinning wheels. So that's a really important piece. Our leads here, they are working towards making sure that we're not just giving solutions to people that are stuck. We want to guide people or unlocking just the next step for them, but not actually taking over the work or um, giving them the solution without really explaining it. And so a lot of times when you do ask a question, you might actually be the response you get might actually be a series of additional questions about what have you tried so far, what things are you thinking it could be, what interesting things have you found related to the solution. So I think there's a lot of we're trying to build that skill of troubleshooting, and there's a lot of that actively day to day.
That's great. Hey, so thanks again for spending some time today talking about being stuck and getting unstuck. I think I picked up a couple things as well, so that's always good.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me.
You made it
All
all
right.
the way to the end. Thanks. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video to hear more content just like this.